Dear all, it's my great pleasure to kick off today's conference, Building a Future-Proof Europe for Migration, that ISPI has organized in cooperation with the European Policy Center, the Migration Policy Center of the European University Institute, GLOBSEC Policy Institute, and the support of the Italian Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Kicking off an event on Europe and migration from Italy, it's almost impossible to avoid the elephant in the room. Over the past 12 months, 175,000 migrants have reached Europe's shores by the sea, and 70% of them landed in Italy. And this means arrivals to Italy are now approaching the record figures of 2014, 2015, 2016, at the time of the Syrian refugee crisis, when over 1 million people reached Greece and then went on to other European countries. That was also the last period when Europe attempted to give a truly European response through the famous relocation schemes and asylum seekers that seem such an unlikely concept today. In fact, Europe policy response on migration is somehow moving slowly, with the usual debate between countries of first arrival, including Italy, asking for more solidarity, main countries of destination in Europe, such as Germany, asking for more responsibility, and Eastern European countries skeptical on any new way forward. This is why in today's conference we ask, is Europe stuck in emergency? Today, however, we are not only looking at how Europe responds in the short term. We also want to encourage our experts to look at the future and tell us how they think Europe will look like tomorrow and over the next 30 years. We do so because we aspire to move the debate beyond crisis management and hopefully encourage European government to prepare for the future, a future where Europeans will be older and external migration pressure might be stronger. I'm pleased to welcome at this opening session Beate Gminder, Deputy Director General Home Affairs and at the European Commission, and Laurence Hart, Director for Italy and Malta at the International Organization for Migration. Let me start with Mrs. Gminder. Thanks for being with us, first of all. The European Commission has proposed its new Pact on Migration and Asylum back in 2020. Where does the legislative package stand today? And what do you expect to achieve before next European election next year?
Thank you very much, Paolo, for that question, and thank you all for the warm welcome. And I'm very happy that I can join you today for this debate from a very sunny Belgium. It's nearly as in Italy today, but very cold. And I also want to start off by paying tribute to, because I think many of the people who are participating in our online conference today are actually working in welcoming refugees and asylum seekers and migrants in Italy. And I would like to thank you, because I know that it has been an enormous peak recently, and this is also due and linked to political events, of course, of the other side of the Mediterranean. We're all very well aware of that. And that's why we also think that the pact that we have been proposing 3 years ago is really a good point of departure to agree on, because it would help us not only to get internally in the EU new rules in place. And this is a set of 10 rules that are quite extensive. They go from legal migration to how we better manage in times of crises. So we would have covered the entire chain of from arrival to massive crisis. So this set of rules has been proposed 3 years ago, and we're very, very, very much now in the end phase of negotiation. And we think that we have a chance to agree to this before the next European Parliament elections. We have about 9 months left, a very tough 9 months, but we also see that Parliament and Council want to conclude these negotiations. And they have been, agreeing at high levels, so with signature of all the 3 leaders of the institutions, that these negotiations will finish before the end of this legislature. Having said that, that is legal reform that we have been proposing is, of course, based on the treaty, on the international conventions, and I think it will really put Europe again on a good point of departure how to treat arrivals, be it someone who truly needs refugee in Europe, be it someone who looks more for economic opportunities. But we need to, all of them, give them an individual assessment, and we have to do this in a very quick manner. And I think fair and fast and efficient procedures is the key to the new legal reforms that we have been proposing. We have this issue of solidarity and responsibility. It is the core where there is discussions between member states. This is very clear. But we can also see that there's a willingness to address that. And I think that's a very important step forward. And at the same time, this pact is not only about laws. It's also a chapter about how do we deal with third countries. And what we're trying already to do, and there's big actually agreement between member states to go about it like this, is that we work jointly as EU with third countries. That we continue to work in a trade and development perspective, but obviously also say very clearly what we need from Europe in terms of their responsibilities. And last but not least, there's of course also a package and a pillar in this pact about border protection and the need to protect the external border, more support from EU agencies like Frontex, and also something about legal migration, but I think we come to this a bit later.
Well, your optimism, Beate, is encouraging, and so let's hope it's the case. We are all confident it would be a major step forward. You mentioned the aim of the European Union to strengthen partnership with third countries. Can you elaborate more on that point?
Well, we definitely have to look at a third country in our relations, not only in terms of migration. We are there for third countries to support them in their development. We are also there to have trade relations, and we have a lot of own interests in these relations as well. I think this has to be very clearly said. So what we're trying is to have a partnership that says, look, these are your needs, these are our needs, and we need to find a fair balance and a fair cooperation there. And it's clear that part of the money we give to third countries is budget support, which is also linked to conditionalities, and part of that are also linked to how to deal with migration, be it returns, be it also, returns of nationals that are not allowed to stay in the European Union, or be it also, budget support for building up their own migration system, because we shouldn't forget, Europe is a destination for many people who are migrating, but obviously in many other countries, in third countries, there's also people who are seeing refugee and are trying to find a job there and build a life there. And that's what we're also trying in partnership to help those countries to build up a good migration and asylum system in their countries. But generally, in the last years, we have been really trying to move out of just this migration pillar and really trying to bring in development aid, trade aid, and also what member states do bilaterally with third countries. So it's not only EU and third country, but also what member states do. This is a huge exercise, not easy, because every member state has different relationships with a country. You in Italy have much closer relationship, of course, with countries like Tunisia and Libya than my home country, which is Germany. So you have different points of departure, but I think this understanding at very high political level that we want to work there helps a lot.
Before we move to Laurence, can I ask you with a short answer if the war our war, the war in Europe, and there are many wars in the world, but the one we are talking about all the time has made the relationship with third countries more complicated. I mean, in the Global South framework, what's your assessment?
I think I can give you a very short answer. It has changed nearly everything in world relations and in world politics. Yes, it did. Positive, negative, but it has set a new point of departure for nearly all bilateral and multilateral relations in this world.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this wide-ranging view on the Commission work, and good luck for your very important work. And you mentioned there are only a few months left before the end of this Commission and the Parliament, so good luck. Now, Laurence, ISPI frequently cooperate with your organization, and we have been hosting together the Migration Forum in Rome over the past 2 years. What do you make of the current debate on migration in Europe, and how can we improve cooperation and dialogue between governments?
Yes, good afternoon, Paolo, and good afternoon to all the distinguished participants and attendees to this conference. We indeed, I want to, at the outset, underline and emphasize the excellent collaboration we've had in the past years in promoting a more balanced dialogue on and collaboration on migration. I think when we talk about cooperation and dialogue, we have to distinguish challenges and successes. We often concentrate on the challenges, and probably when we read newspapers, it's no mystery that we read about the lack of search and rescue mechanism, the lack of the predictable disembarkation mechanisms, the problems in countries of origin and transit of migration, the problems related to the reception of migrants, the screening in often overcrowded structures, which make people invisible in the end, and also I would like to underline the need for more solidarity and the need for more burden sharing. And often the debate is concentrated, the political debate is concentrated on these issues, which is obviously a series of issues which are problems that are there. But we often neglect the successes that we have had on migration, which remain largely untapped or remain to be scaled up. For example, the impact on the economy of national economies of migration. How much does that contribute to the development of societies in EU member states? Statistics tell us that is overwhelmingly positive. What is the impact of the multiculturality in the private sector, which in the end promotes and enhances innovation and competitiveness? The role of local authorities and cities, who are frontliners, responders, and who often provide innovative responses which go beyond the narrative which are discussed at capital levels. The resilience, for example, that has been increased by migration in areas suffering from depopulation. All of these last topics remain largely undiscussed, but we are sitting on a gold mine, and I'm really saying a gold mine, because if we were to concentrate a little bit more on this, probably we would defocus only on the emergency approach that we have. We have also a lot of data nowadays that we collect as IOM, but also as other organizations. And this exceptional potential data has to inform policies and promote accurate migration narratives. Oftentimes we don't look at, or politicians don't look at this data. And then finally, as a last point that I would like to bring is in the debate, is what we need to develop and implement comprehensive approaches which entail large partnerships from whole of society approach, not just the governments, but think tanks, diaspora, other policy areas. And we must look at migration, also from the angle of human rights, humanitarian issues, education, health, employment, security, and environment. These are key elements that need to be factored, not just disembarkation and arrivals, because the numbers, if we look at numbers, yes, we did have in Italy, for example, 100,000 arrivals in 2022. And we call it emergency. But when we look at the arrivals from Ukraine, which total approximately 300,000, we don't talk about that as an emergency. So there is a disconnect in that narrative. And then we're talking about fixing the problems in the European Union, but we're not looking at what the situation at large is just in the Mediterranean. If we look at the countries starting from Turkey, going down to Israel, going to Syria, to Egypt, to Libya, to Tunisia, to Algeria, we see that these are realities which are either under a situation of conflict or a situation of economic crunch. So these elements need to be addressed in order to reduce the flows if we want to tackle the issue of migration in a more comprehensive manner. I won't dwell on the pact on asylum and migration because Beate has already given a little overview on that, but obviously that is also part of ensuring cohesiveness. What we are seeing nowadays is basically that there is a lot of fight between EU member states, and this attitude is trickling down to countries of transit and countries of origin. Migration is often used as a scapegoat to hide other problems. So therefore, importance also of that pact, because we need to go towards more cohesive responses.
Thanks. You mentioned that we should not concentrate only on governments, but we have to be honest, in debates on migration, we constantly talk about government. And by doing so, we often lose sight of people. I'm talking, as you did, about migrants, diaspora, and their associations. And do you think that a more people-centered approach could help or point to better solutions?
Well, indeed, yes. The short answer is yes. A people-centered approach is certainly key. At IOM, we have put migrants and diaspora communities at the center of our responses to ensure that the actions that we promote include their voices, struggles, and ideas on how to better address the challenges of migration and promote its developmental impact. For example, the cultural mediators IOM deploys throughout Italy to work with institutions in several areas, from border governance to reception and integration, are migrants themselves. So sometimes migrants can be, obviously, we can look at them as beneficiaries, but we also have to look at them as assets because they provide themselves the answers to many of the issues. Now, you mentioned diasporas, and indeed, diaspora groups are powerhouses of innovation. Why they are powerhouses of innovation? Let me just mention four quick areas where diasporas are an asset. First of all, their economic contribution that they give to the countries they live in and the countries they come from. They have good connections and they're able to transmit capacities, skills to the countries of origin, but also to acquire and provide a diversified response in the countries of destination. Secondly, the cultural heritage and diversity that they bring with them. Now, cultural diversity it can be seen as a value or as a hindrance in depending on the walk of life you come from. But in the end, for example, the private sector is increasingly looking to being multicultural because this enhances the possibilities to open up in new markets. And migrants and the diaspora groups provide exactly that. The third point is, what do diaspora provide? First, the charity that they give within their countries, families and friends that are hit by a crisis. So they know what kind of responses are needed in the countries of origin. And finally, their entrepreneurship, the ability to innovate and create social change. So migrant diaspora are among the first to respond when a disaster strikes in the countries of origin. And we have to make them part of the response. And I would like to cite, a very recent examples. When the conflict in Ukraine broke out, IOM and brought to the table, thanks also to the availability of the Italian government, the diaspora community, so that the diaspora could be part of the response and the dialogue and not just be beneficiaries as responses, so identifying the key needs of the Ukrainian community.
Thank you, Laurence, and thank you, Beate. I hope your comments and your words will feed into the discussion of our two sessions. And now I'm glad to leave the floor to Antonio Villafranca, who will moderate the first session on diversity, Migration 2050, a super diverse Europe. Thank you very much.
Welcome back. Here we are at the first session of today's conference. The title is Migration 2050, a super diverse Europe, because usually when we talk about migration, and also we had two very interesting keynote speakers at the beginning, we already mentioned it, well, the perspective that we take, and especially unfortunately policymakers take, is the short run. Migration is always an urgent matter. Well, in this session, in this first session, we will try to adopt a different perspective. We will look at 2050, and in particular, we will try to understand if, to what extent, Europe in 2050 is going to be a super diverse continent. And then we have here our speakers, and I would like to introduce them right away, because they can, of course, be more specific on also what a super diverse Europe means. So let me thank, first of all, the speakers we have today. Matteo Villa is ISPI Senior Research Fellow and co-head of the ISPI Data Lab. Thank you, Matteo. Grammenos Mastrojeni, Deputy Secretary General of the Union for the Mediterranean. Thank you very much, of course, Mr. Mastrojeni, for being with us. And Andrew Geddes, Director of the Migration Policy Center of the European University Institute and Senior Associate Research Fellow at ISPI. So thank you very much, Andrew, for being with us. So before we start, let me just remind all our our audience that there will be room for Q&A at the end of each session. So I kindly invite you to use the chat tool that you will find here on the platform, so you can make your questions. And of course, I think that our speakers will be glad to answer. So without further ado, let me start with Matteo. Matteo, the first question for you is also the easy one. I mean, what does a super diverse Europe means? I mean, is it really so that we are going to experience a super diverse Europe in 2050? And what does it mean as a sort of side effect of migration flows over the next decades? Please, Matteo.
Right. Thank you so much, Antonio, for this. And yes, just as a quick introduction, super diverse. It is, of course, a controversial term, but at the same time, it is a pretty specific term to say, we are going to face something like, Europe will be almost like London is today, right? So many ethnicities, so many languages, so many, say, citizenships, especially also from outside the UK, living together in the same area. So when we ask this question, we're also wanting to ask, is migration really changing and fast, at fast-paced rhythm and speed, the face of Europe so much so that in 2050 it would be less recognizable, or is it, going to be similar to today? And to address this, let me just point to the fact that a few years ago we did some projections. We were wondering whether here at ISPI, we were wondering whether migration from Africa to Europe would change, would increase a lot. Starting from the basic fact that we know that population in Africa is increasing. It was on the rise. It's been on the rise since the 1960s. It has doubled already 3 times over 50 years. They started as 250 million people, then they became 500 million people in 1980, then 1 billion, so again, a doubling by 2015. And they're expected to double as the population of the continent to 2 billion by 2050. So does it mean that migrants from Africa to Europe will double as well? And just to make a long story short, our models do not point to that. Migration from Africa to Europe is seen as pretty much stabilizing after having increased over the past 5 years, over the past 10 years, pretty much stabilizing to about 200,000 people every year. Of course, these are projections. Why is it so? Why is it not doubling? The reasons that the models point to say even Africans are getting older, not just us. And as you get older, you have lower propensity to migrate. So again, a continent that will have a lot of population, but the propensity to migrate will decline. And at the same time, an increase in migration within Africa. So within the African continent, across African countries. That will change the way and the propensity to migrate to Europe. In the end, what does it mean for Europe in 2050 in terms of African migration to Europe? The percentage of Africans living in Europe is set to go from 2% to around 3.5% by 2050. It's less than a doubling, even as the European population is set to shrink. So that's it. Are we becoming super diverse? It doesn't seem so. For sure, this doesn't count the people from African descent that will get, European citizenship, and it doesn't count the other persons who will be born in Europe from people of African descent. But again, it doesn't say. It points to Europe that is pretty much, similar to in the way it is today, and not changing in unprecedented ways.
Thank you, Matteo. Let me move now to Mr. Mastrojeni. Mr. Mastrojeni, keeping this long-term perspective, mid to long-term perspectives, decades, there's no doubt that all over the world, climate change is going to be, an important factor when it comes to migration. And when it comes specifically, of course, to Europe, my question to you is, what to expect in terms of migration flows coming from the Mediterranean, from the southern part of the Mediterranean to Europe due to climate change and to, of course, extreme weather conditions that we keep experiencing actually nowadays, and possibly, unfortunately, even more over the next years and decades. Please.
Thank you so much. First of all, yes, I will only limit myself to the relationship between climate and migration, which is what I know. And let me point out that there is this misconception according to which extreme events are those that fuel migration, which is not true. Extreme events actually fuel short-range or short-term movements, but they don't really push migration. What is pushing migrations is the growing uncertainty in the behavior of climate. Simply, if a valley is flooded, and it was not before, you move your house 200 meters upwards. But if you start not knowing when there will be rainfall, then you cannot organize your agricultural activity. And that is really fueling migration. But this is just a point. I think we need to reason about the general and generic word that we use, migration. Not everything is the same. And I'll give you an example. To counter climate change, together with the European Commission, we are, for instance, planning a large-scale operation of integration of the energy markets around the Mediterranean, which is also functional to other dynamics that we are experiencing nowadays. If this happens, there will be a significant circulation of people, north-south, south-north, east-west, and there will also be integration of markets that will come afterwards, inducing even more population movements. Is this a problem? Absolutely not. We see it as a solution. It becomes a problem if every movement is treated through rules that consider migration a problem. First point. Second point, when you talk about climate change, you cannot talk about migration. Who is a migrant? A migrant is someone who, even in a reduced way, has a voluntary choice to move somewhere else to improve their quality of life. And we have the notion that the poorer you are, the more you have a propension to migrate, which is not true. Below a certain level of income, actually, you cannot conceive migration. You're obliged to stay where you are because you're too poor to move. Now, what does climate change do? Current impacts of climate change can be absorbed by those people who have a level of income that allows them to contemplate migrating. So climate change does not induce them to migrate. On the contrary, people who are below this level of income, when climate change strikes, they are obliged to move for their survival. And this makes it that their movements are not migrations, they are forced population movements. And this is very, very dangerous because there is an economic sector that rescues those people faster than anyone else. And unfortunately, it's not the IOM, it is illegality. These people become prey to dynamics that fuel smuggling, terrorism, and this kind of things. So now, what's happening in the Mediterranean? The situation is quite different from sub-Saharan Africa because the level of income is a little bit more stabilized. People are induced to move. The potential for movement is very high if certain things happen. For instance, a very quick sea level rise that can salinize our coastal plains and jeopardize food security in many places. Let's think, for instance, of the Delta of the Nile. Just 20 centimeters sea level increase will salinize the Delta of the Nile and jeopardize food security of a country that has more than 100 billion people. What we are doing is that we need to put these people in a condition to face this according to a free choice. Normally, if they are in these conditions, then even climate change impacts do not force them to migrate, but might advise the movements that are necessary to restructure the whole economic machinery to cope with this.
Yeah, let me ask you something, because there are some people asking for the recognition of this kind of migrants due to climate change, for instance, as refugees. Would you agree with this definition? Because, you know, it's a tricky and complex, of course, situation.
Okay. Basically, you know, my background, I am a lawyer. And as a lawyer, I know that legal definitions do not really change the reality. The problem is larger, but then I leave it to our friends at IOM to speak better about this. The fact is that being a refugee or not should not depend on the nature of the act that has put you in a very difficult situation. It should depend on the gravity of the situation you are in. But this was not what happened. At the beginning, we selected some categories because it was practical, and I know that in, let's say, in the competent instances, there is a certain fear to reopen the debate, that if we start including one category, then there will be the request for including other categories, and in the end, we might lose even what we had before. I don't think that climate pressures make it for a special status. Whoever risks their lives should be protected. And it's not my job. I would rather push for a more general rethinking of the idea of refugee rather than rethinking the categories that qualify.
Yeah, thank you very much for this frank answer. So let me move now to Andrew Geddes. Andrew, thank you very much again for cooperating with us on this event and being with us today. Andrew, you have been working a lot on migration governance. And we said at the beginning of this session that we are trying to take a sort of long-term perspective. So under this perspective, do you really think that, you know, we can learn from the past, and maybe with the dynamics that also Matteo mentioned, probably our response as Europeans to migration pressures will change over time?
Well, thank you for that question. First of all, just to thank ISPI for organising this event and say how happy we are at the Migration Policy Centre to be associated with it, along with the EPC GLOBSEC. It's a great pleasure. I think one reason why it's really important is precisely for the reason that you just identified, the importance of long-term thinking about policies, about migration flows, also about attitudes to migration as well, because all of those things, there are important long-term patterns and trends which we do need to be aware of, and which will play an important role in, or have played important roles in, influencing responses to migration, and will play important roles in the future. So I understand the point that was made earlier, that policy itself can be quite reactive, tendencies towards crisis mode and to emergency. But there are quite important structural factors when we look at policies, flows, and attitudes, which I think we need to bear in mind. And so the question you just asked, I think, is really important. And as Matteo has pointed out, I think Europe is becoming more diverse. Whether it's becoming more super diverse, I'm not sure about that. But you know, diversity is I think a characteristic of many European societies. I think it's also becoming something of a dividing line in European societies as well. And as you can probably tell, I'm from the UK, but not only in the UK, in other countries as well. There's been political contention around diversity, European integration, immigration, globalization, broadly defined. And so I think we need to be conscious of maybe some of the dividing lines in European politics that bring together issues like immigration and European integration, and people who feel as though they may be winners or losers in these processes. And to come back very directly to the question you asked me about, well, what can the past teach us? Well, I think the past can teach us a lot. And so we do need to be aware of the kind of maybe some of the deeper structural factors. And I'd point out two things which I think are quite relevant. If we look back until really, well, in the period since the end of the Second World War, there is quite strong evidence of kind of liberalisation in European migration policies towards labour, towards students, towards family migration, and to some extent towards protection towards asylum and refugee migration. But, and this is really important, I think, over the last 20 years, what we've seen is a much stronger focus on what you could call selectivity in migration policies, drawing a distinction between those forms of migration that are seen as wanted or beneficial by governments and those that are seen as less wanted and beneficial. And that particularly coalesces around education and skills as the basis for selectivity. And I think that is quite an important trend. So rather than, say, diversity being a driver of policy, I think that a quest for selectivity, which has quite strong economic foundations, is an important aspect of European migration policy. And I think what we should also be aware of is that education and skills are obviously unevenly distributed globally, and the recognition of education and skills from lower income countries tends to be more difficult. So the movement towards selectivity, I think, was an important driver of migration policies and has important implications for the future development of those policies and relationship to higher and lower income countries. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Andrew. But let me get back to you with the same question I made to Mr. Mastrojeni. When it comes to this, new typology of refugees, as a scholar, would you agree on, these, climate refugees over the next decades? Something on this could be done, or do you see it as a sort of boomerang? Because we know what is also people's reaction to, refugees today. By enlarging the scope of refugees, we risk, increasing this anti-refugees sentiment among people. What do you think about it?
It's a very good point. A few years ago, I was involved in a report for the UK government, which was a foresight report trying to think about the implications of environmental change for human migration through until 2050. So that kind of similar time frame to today's event. And one of the issues we looked at was the expansion of the definition of refugee to include the effects of climate change. I think that one of the issues there would be the difficulty, the very high level of difficulty in expanding the category of refugee, given the kind of political context in which that would need to occur. So I think sort of imagining a refined category of refugee would be difficult for political reasons, but that doesn't mean that the challenges are not pressing and urgent of human migration linked to environmental and climate change. What I'd also point out, and I think this has already been observed, is the challenges are quite complex. It's not, and it's certainly not just that people are going to be moving in the direction of Europe. We know that a lot of the displacement will be internal to states. A lot of it will be towards urban areas where people then may encounter other environmental risks. And we also know that one of the big challenges around climate is immobility, because the climate effects can reduce the ability of people to migrate. So I think, to respond directly to your question, the political climate could make an expanded definition of refugee quite difficult, but the challenges are very urgent.
Thank you, Andrew. So let me get back now to Matteo. Matteo, we all know that aging population is a real problem for Europe, for other mature economies around the world, and there is a sort of rhetoric that we need migrants, young migrants, especially coming from Africa, where the average age is quite low, for a sort of rejuvenation, of Europe. But in concrete terms, considering the demographic trends in Europe and also the number of migrants which could arrive at our shores over the next decades, I mean, also statistically, is it significant? I mean, all this migration could really rejuvenize the European Union?
Yeah, sure. So, well, let's start from maybe the recent past. I would say, first of all, we know, as you, Antonio, said, the fertility rates in the European Union have been below the replacement rate, so 2.1 births per woman. We know they are today, they are at 1.5, but maybe we forget that they have been below 2.1 since 1976, so for decades. And just to give you the context of migration, let's say, the positive context of migration first. In the past 20 years, between 2000 and 2018, before EU population started to decline, because let's also remember that. So since 2018, European Union's population is now stabilizing and declining, but the growth rate, the growth in terms of population between 2000 and 2018 was 18 million people, and out of them, 40 million were net immigrants. So 80% of that contribution was from immigration. So yeah, we can say it makes a significant, maybe marginal, because we're 500 million if you count also the United Kingdom, but significant contribution. But then, do we expect this to lead to a younger continent, or maybe a continent that can support better a welfare state system, especially the pension system? Well, the answer is maybe so, but mainly not. Why? Let me give you also another point. Today, the median age in Europe is 42 years old. It means 50% of the people in Europe are over 42 and 50% are less. Like in sub-Saharan Africa, if you take it today, it's 18. So 50% of the population there is a minor. They are children or teenagers. What could change given the migration trends that we've seen before? Well, the median age in Europe is set to rise from 42 years old to 47 by 2050. So we're aging. What does migration contribute to this? It's slowing down the rate at which this increases. So it's a bit helping to slow down the rate of aging, and so it slows down a bit the urgency with which we need to do reforms. But still, it will not be able to stop our aging, according to the projections, which means that in the end, reforming, for instance, the pension system in Europe will be urgent, even for the migrants of today, because of course the migrants of today might be the pensioners of tomorrow. So again, just to close this reasoning, yes, migration does help Europe not aging too fast, but it's not such a huge contribution that it will allow us to, again, keep ourselves from aging in Europe. So again, the policy response can be increasing a bit of regular migration in order to slow down this process as well, again, but at the same time, it just recognizes that this is a small part of a response, and it's not a solution for making our social welfare system sustainable over the long term.
To make a long story short, basically, yes, there is a positive contribution which could come from migration flows, especially from young migrants, and usually migrants are quite young, but not to the extent that, a reform of the pension system, for instance, is not needed. So let me now go again to Mr. Mastrojeni. Mr. Mastrojeni, what can countries and governments in the Mediterranean do to foster adaptation to a changing climate, meanwhile adapting to increased migration flows? Are the two challenges related in policy responses as well?
Absolutely. Actually, I was hinting to this at the beginning of what I said. Climate change will bring a very significant circulation of people, and this is part of the adaptation process. I mentioned energy at the beginning. Let me mention, for instance, a sector which is not only fun and pleasure, which is wine and vine. It's a very important economic sector. Plants are migrating north very quickly. This implies that new techniques, new know-hows need to be reshuffled all over the place, and this implies a population movement. We have been witnessing increasing cooperation in the agriculture and forestry sector between the north and south shore of the Mediterranean, simply because the plants, That's the phytogenetic heritage, which is vital and commercial on the south shore of the Mediterranean right now, will probably be the one that can save our agricultures and economies in the near future. So if we start seeing this important dynamic and even structural movement of people as a problem, we create ourselves a problem. We need to understand that this is a natural adaptation system.
Thank you very much. So now just let me remind to our audience that there is the chat tool you can use. Let me take one question coming from the chat tool, from the chat. It is from Eduardo, and if it is fine with you, Andrea, I would make this question to you. It's quite a provocative question. How can Europe preserve the human rights of refugees when national governments can dismantle them without backlash?
Who's that question to, sorry?
For you, Andrew.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you for the question. And as somebody coming from the UK, that's a very, very relevant question because, as you may know, the UK government has entered into an agreement with Rwanda to effectively deport people who are entering the country in ways that the government has defined as irregular, and to consign them to a country where they will be where they can make an asylum application with no possibility of moving to the UK. So I think that what you've identified there is a really important issue because I think it's a very relevant question to ask in the European context, which is the commitment of higher income countries to refugee protection. So that is not to say that no refugee protection occurs or that countries are withdrawing from their commitments, but there is evidence, and not only in the UK, in other countries too, of weakened commitment and, in a way, a kind of a delegitimization of the refugee protection framework, in particular through the way in which people are consigned to routes that are defined as irregular and as such dealt with as irregular migrants, even though they may have a basis for entry into for some form of protection. So that's not to say that that is just the characteristic of all European countries, but I think it's a very relevant point that was raised in this question. Thank you.
And Andrew, I mean, you are raising also another big problem, probably the elephant in the room when it comes to the European management of migration flows, which is fragmentation, which is a nationalistic approach also to the problem, to the challenge of migration. Do you see any possibility that, especially in the European Union, I mean, there will be a change in the way governments are approaching the problem, or fragmentation will be with us also for many years, if not decades?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure I can give you an opinion, but not necessarily an answer. But I think underlying the point of the question, and as I say, it's a very good question, is really the kind of relationship between governments and their citizens, and this broader question maybe of citizens' attitudes. And we do quite a lot of work on that here at the Migration Policy Centre, and it may surprise some people to learn that over the last 20 or 30 years, attitudes towards migration across the European Union become more, not less favourable. There are some variations, some countries it's less evident, but that's quite a long-term trend across the European Union. That doesn't mean there's a kind of tidal wave of pro-migration sentiment, but I think it is significant and probably linked to generational change in Europe. What I'd also say is that this kind of trend towards greater favourability to migration has also been associated in recent years with greater awareness of the European Union's role. So I think that EU citizens are increasingly looking to the EU as being responsible for migration policy. That's certainly the case, I think, in Italy, where this kind of maybe what we could call the Europeanization of migration policy has entered into the consciousness of citizens that this is increasingly a European issue. So I think that's a big challenge for the European Union. It goes directly to your question, because at the moment we can see that the European response is fragmented. But I would make a distinction between two aspects of policy, the internal and the external. On the internal dimension, member states have found it very difficult to reach agreement on what they refer to as solidarity, sharing responsibility, burden sharing, however you want to label it, but reaching agreement on kind of what you might call an internal response to migration within the European Union. But I think there's greater consensus amongst the member states on what could be called the external dimension, which is working more closely with non-EU member states, and we heard this in the very first session, trying to build partnership and thinking about how to strengthen cooperation with non-EU member states. And I think that there's more agreement there. And as a final point, it really goes to what we would expect from this policy area. We know it's a policy area where there can be high levels of national sensitivity. It's an issue that relates quite closely to national sovereignty. So I would expect that this kind of, I mean, not necessarily disjointed or fragmented, but that this is an area where it will be more difficult to reach agreement because of the sensitivities. And that's a characteristic of a policy. It's a feature of the system, not a bug in the system.
Andrew, I remain with you just for another question coming from Jennifer, and then I move back to Mastrojeni and Villa. Jennifer is asking, how do you expect the war in Ukraine to impact Africa-Europe relation?
That's a great question. Thank you, Jennifer. Well, I think that one of the things that we can see, and it's already been referred to, is that Europe's attention is very focused on Ukraine, and we know that around 8 million people have been displaced from Ukraine. So just to, I suppose it's self-publicity, but with a colleague here, we just wrote a short article for Euractiv, the Euractiv blog for EU News, which was looking at the implications for the war in Ukraine on Mediterranean migration. Because I think there is a significant risk that the EU takes its eye off the ball. So without going into all the details, and I know that other speakers have a lot to say, I think it's a very relevant question because of the high political salience and the enormous focus on Ukraine, which could mean that the eye is taken off other important pressing issues to the south of Europe. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. So now let me get back to Mr. Mastrojeni. And now we have another question from Pietro, who said, what are the factors shaping migration decisions? And what do you expect could happen over the next few decades, given the current socioeconomic trends, especially in Africa?
Okay. So let me once again point that I am committed to talking about climate and environment-induced population movements. So your question is very important, but I don't feel I have all the elements to reply to you. Let me just take it from my angle. Well, there's not an issue of taking autonomous decisions. There needs to be a science-oriented policy that reacts to trends which are predictable. We know that climate change is dangerous in terms of human security and migrations, not only because the impacts are becoming more and more severe, but especially on the Mediterranean, because this area is highly asymmetrical, and it becomes even more asymmetrical in the south. What does it mean? It means that our area, if we consider, and I think it makes sense to consider Europe, southern shore of the Mediterranean and the Sahel, like a continuous sphere. We could also run the same reasoning towards the east, but then it would enlarge too much. The fact is that if you have a patchwork of people who can resist and people who cannot resist, there is, if you take it in a certain way, a potential for conflict. If you take it in another way, that is that you try to valorize the complementarities of the different situations. Some of them are there, but they are hidden, and I will give you an example. You take a completely different policy decision and policy orientation. the important thing is that, inspired by science, the governments understand that the solution here is the integration of potentials, which is very important for climate change. So let me give you an example. I was mentioning before that phylogenetic heritage is moving north. In other terms, within not such a long time, in 10, 15 years, probably the lands of Southern Europe will be very similar in terms of climate and in terms of characteristics to those that have been the lands of North Africa and one part of the Sahel during thousands of years. What does it mean? We see the South as a cluster of poverty and lack of resources. We see the North as the rich guys. Well, let me mention to you, if you go down south along the Silk Road, you will find some cone-shaped buildings called the yakchal, which in Persian means the fridges. And these are places where merchants used to stock perishable goods, because inside there, the temperature, no matter how hot it was outside, was always between 0 and -4. Who needs who? If you go down south, there are traditional irrigation systems called the kanat that manage to collect the humidity of the desert during the night and transform it into real underground rivers, which were used by the Persians to literally grow gardens in the desert. So who needs who? The important thing, and I know I'm cutting to some results without really explaining all the implications of your question, but the important things is that policy is inspired by science and not by guts, and recognizes that the solution is the integration of the knowledges, resources that we have, and that we must forget the idea that some places are resourceless, whereas other places are totally rich and could be just, the place where it's heaven and everybody wants to go.
Thank you. Remaining on basically almost on the same topic, there is a question from Bob. It is for Andrew, Matteo, so I will get back to you after this question. So, Andrew, Bob asks, would it not be better to stop speaking about migration and be more specific, like workers, family reunification, students, asylum seekers, refugees, researchers? I mean, I think it's a very interesting question because, it's not only about changing the words, but it's just, placing the spotlight on the problems. If we have problems with workers, if we need workers, very well qualified, for instance, workers, all our companies need it. Instead of talking about migrants, we should talk about, students to be trained in our universities. I mean, changing also the language, so categorize, migrants in a different way could be helpful in your view.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, because we know that international migration comes in many forms, and in a sense it's almost analytically useless just to refer to this thing of international migration without recognizing the diversity of types, employment, different movements, different types of employment. We also know that family migration is highly significant as well, and a very important characteristic. And we know that international student migration is extremely important. I think one of the problems of policies instead of bundling those things together. But also I would say that we are, I think distracted is the word, because it is a very important issue, but we are very focused on asylum seeking and irregular migration, which are very important, and the loss of life in the Mediterranean is a huge tragedy. But I think it's extremely relevant to any discussion of migration to be conscious of these kind of distinctions, because when people often people don't understand that international students are actually often counted as migrants, and that so the numbers that enter into debate and that people might express concern about actually contain forms of migration they're not concerned about. I think any effort to break down the discussion would be very welcome. So I think that's a very important point that Bob has made.
Could be of help, basically. So, Matteo, my question for you is more on the international part of it, and especially the way countries and governments, and I'm talking about the usual suspects, can instrumentalize, the issue of migration to put pressure on other states and governments. Some example, of course, which comes up to my mind is, of course, as I said, the usual ones. I mean, the usual suspects. Belarus. We all remember, of course, what happened just, some months ago, just before the Ukraine war. But in a way, also Turkey did it this way for good or bad. I mean, but to some extent did it with the European Union. Morocco, again, to some extent, of course, in a very different way. Indirectly, also, we could also think of Ukraine, which is using, the issue of migrants for obvious reasons that we all understand. So, do you expect this trend is going to accelerate in the future? I mean, migration being used by states and government as a sort of weapon, inverted commas, against other countries.
Yeah, really, I think it echoes the response by Andrew, also the one from Grammenos. I mean, it's really a policy matter, right? How governments in Europe respond. And, for instance, Ukraine, it's an interesting fact, Russia, in the end, instrumentalized migration from Ukraine, meaning, the more refugees there are, the more the refugees will come, the more the European Union's response might be, more fragmented or so on. And it was actually instead very united, at least at first. And it's maybe now fragmenting a bit, but still very united. And on the other hand, you mentioned Belarus, and that's exactly the opposite, right? A crisis that was really invented by President Lukashenko, so the last dictator of Europe, taking thousands of people, mainly from Kurdistan, flying them inside the country, then using them to push them towards Poland in order to increase and raise the pressure on Europe and lead them to negotiate. If you look at numbers, let's say 3.5, almost 4 million Ukrainians now live in Europe, and they have been coordinatedly welcomed. Take the Iraqis, the Kurdish people who came mostly from Iraq and Turkey into Belarus. There were only 20,000 of them, of which like 10,000 went to Germany. Only 20,000 of them were there. And yet the response from Europe was, first of all, helping Poland building and financing a wall with Belarus at a time in which Poland was actually arguing with the European Commission, in the rule of law matters, in so many other issues. That helped Poland to, use the migration fortress and anyway, migration response as saying, okay, we're still important in Europe. And so, you see exactly from Eastern Europe, the same, very different pressures, very different responses. And this actually gives a hint to other governments. So let me summarize, for instance, from Morocco. We've seen Moroccans, it seems at least, the government of Morocco in May 2021 sending or pushing a few thousand Moroccans towards this Ceuta enclave, Spanish enclave, to punish Spain because they had flown in Spain to be cured in the hospital, the leader of the Sahrawi movement, which is, a secessionist movement in Morocco, asking for independence of the Western Sahara. And that was seen as a punishment or as a negotiation tool. The Spanish response was, yeah, we can, negotiate, but will not stand down and back down from our position. And it was an interesting one because in the end, then the Moroccan government again went into the diplomatic table without punishing Spain again too much. So I guess really it comes down the future of whether this can be used as a tool by countries to threaten and blackmail Europe will really come down on our response if we react in a way haphazardly and very vehemently to a small set of migrants appearing at our borders, like in Belarus, it will be easier for the governments to follow suit if we react a bit more ordinarily and without always, reacting too strongly at first. Then it will be most likely less easy to use from other, usual suspects, as you said.
Mr. Mastrojeni, I think it was your first answer. You mentioned that, of course, there is one extreme weather condition taking place in a country, you just move your place, your home, your house, from, that place to a place which is quite close. But when, of course, there is a repetition of extreme weather events, then you start thinking that it's better to move. And usually, in Europe especially, we think that when people decide to move, they go to Europe. Well, it's not exactly like this. Basically, they move, inside the same country or, in a country which is next to it for economic reasons, for geographical reasons, for many reasons that we can understand, language, and so on. Do you think that climate change could be a push factor for intra-African mobility over the next years and decades, mostly?
It's not that I think it could be, it is already. I heard someone one day telling me that the problem with Europe is that they consider migration, and they tackle migration as though it was a European problem and not an African problem. We only receive the tip of the iceberg. Nobody can really say how many people are on the move because of climate change, but it's estimated around the 20 million. What is on the move? As I said, we receive the tip of the iceberg. There is a lot of mobility from countryside to cities. Then there is a lot of seasonal movements. And to us, it looks something not so terrible, but it has a lot of disgregating effects on society and economy. Lots of people on the move with some tensions that are arising, turning these movements into occasions for conflict. We can see a lot of it around Lake Chad that has shrunk almost 18 times over 40 years in these things. Coming to your first question, yes, there is. This is unfortunate because it leads to maybe wrong policy decision. There is this idea that what makes people move is extreme weather events. One or the other, or even the repetition of extreme weather events does not cause structural movement. As I told, if you learn that your valley that used to be dry starts to be flooded, even if these floods are repeating, you don't move long range. You just move short range. What is making people move is uncertainty. And you can see very well over the Sahel band. The Sahel band is also the area of desertification. It coincides with the area of concentration of terrorist dynamics, of illegal trafficking, of hunger, conflicts, but also as the point of departures of many of these movements which are inside Africa. What's happening in the Sahel is not the fact that there are extreme weather events. It is the fact that rainfall patterns have slightly changed. The same amount of rainfall arrives during a shorter period of time, which is not certain anymore. Some 3 years ago, I was in Mali, where there was a certain panic among farmers, but not because they lack water, but because it had rained before the predicted time. It was not floods. It was not hurricanes, but a rainfall that arrives before you expect ruins your investment in seeds. And in that context, it means that it obliges you to seek for solutions.
Sure. So now I have a question for Mr. Geddes. Again, from Stefano. How can we stop seeing regularization as a taboo, regularizing undocumented migrants can be beneficial seeing the lack of return practices. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it's. I wouldn't say that I was an expert on that specific question, but we do know that there have been many regularizations across Europe in recent years. But we do know that also at European Union level, there's a kind of a preference for member states not to engage in regularization. But we know that here in Italy during the pandemic, there was an attempt to regularize the position of some workers here in Italy. But although there's some administrative issues that made it difficult to achieve its objectives, I think it's an important point that is made, because I suppose that goes back to a point I made at the start, which there are kind of big structural issues here. The way that, when we think about irregularity, we might imagine, people coming across on small boats, but actually many irregular migrants, or most irregular migrants, enter via regular routes and find employment. Often that employment is an informal economy where they are open to abuse and exploitation. So I think, having a debate about irregular migration that is focused on the kind of the real dynamics of irregular migration and its relationship to our economies, the way we live our lives, the way we look after elderly people, the way we look after children, the way we expect our food to be prepared and delivered, allows us then to see that very much this point about the presence of an irregular population and whose rights, I think, would deserve protection.
I have a question from, sorry if I might mispronounce the name, Anon, I suppose. How could Europe build a coherent common policy of asylum granting towards Russian and Belarusian refugees fleeing from authoritarian countries? I mean, we have to consider also a growing number of people leaving Russia and Belarus because they want to live, in different countries with freedom of speech, with all the things that we can enjoy in the European Union. What should we do, and what the European Union should do for these refugees or migrants? Is something in between. I don't know who wants to, maybe Matteo, and then of course Mr. Mastrojeni or Andrew. First, Matteo.
Yeah, maybe I misunderstood the question, but we can already do something for them. Of course, there are at least asylum channels. It's true that, for instance, for Russians that leave their country, we've seen a weird response, right? Like, we've given asylum to some, and also, we've even given refuge to some. But for instance, Finland has been drawing up its own border and even fences at the border with Russia in order to decrease and stop the flow of Russians escaping from the country. It was not a huge flow, but it's true that we even took steps to decrease that. So, of course, it's been really, again, a problem of policy response in the face that we have asylum rights and protection rights that may even go beyond asylum. We even have subsidiary protection that we can offer to Russians and Belarusians. So those who want to flee the country and be protected, they can. For sure they can today. The problem is, how do you reach Europe if we continue to build fences, even for those people that in the end we are actually, taking as, let's at least portray them as strategic rivals like Russians, and from a country like Finland who just entered NATO. So yes, it's a duplicit policy response again.
Andrew, I suppose you agree because you were moving coherently.
Yes. And I think the Finnish example is very, very, very timely and relevant to consider.
Okay, now I have one final question for you, because I have the feeling, and I wonder if you share this feeling with me, that when it comes to Ukrainian refugees, especially if we read these flows from the southern shore of the Mediterranean, the European Union is, using very different weights, especially when compared to refugees escaping from wars and conflict from the southern shore of the Mediterranean and for Africa. Of course, We did it with the Ukrainians for very good reasons. We all support it. But seen from the southern shore of the Mediterranean, there is this feeling that, I mean, you are using different criteria. Because when there are, our crises, our wars, you are very selective, you are very careful, you be really focused on figures, how many people are coming, how they are coming. Then we just in a matter of days, we say everybody can come from Ukraine, but that's just because there is, a European war. Do you agree? Maybe I will start from Mr. Mastrojeni. I mean, seen from the southern shore of the Mediterranean, do you really think that there is this feeling about different ways?
You're asking me something that I'm not an expert in. What I can tell you, we work with governments. We also work with stakeholders on this, and I've never heard this comparison. There is rather a longing for an understanding, a better understanding of what's going on there. The message that I receive is, if you don't treat our strife as necessarily illegal and you give us chances through the channels of legality, you will probably have less important flows and flows that do not cause you problems.
Very, very clear. Andrew, do you want to add something on this specifically?
Just a very quick point. I think the question is about whether there are double standards, but obviously the point with the people displaced from Ukraine is many could move to Europe because there are provision for visa-free travel. And also what the European Union did within a matter of days was activate the Temporary Protection Directive, which doesn't channel displaced Ukrainians into the asylum system. It provides a temporary protection which could run until 2025. And so was there a different response to displaced Ukrainians? Absolutely yes, through the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive and also existing provisions for visa-free travel. So I think that those are very important aspects of the European response, which make it quite different to responses to people fleeing war in say, Syria, for example.
Thank you very much. So I will keep doing questions, but of course we're running out of time. And so let me just thank Grammenos Mastrojeni. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks a lot, of course, to Andrew Geddes. While I don't say goodbye to Matteo, because now he changed his hat and he will be the moderator of the next session. So please, for our audience, remain with us as we go on with the second session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Conference. Europe for migration. I can still feel okay. Thank you so much. Building a future-proof Europe for migration. And this second session, after we've seen, we've mostly focused on the future of what could happen in Europe, even though we already touched upon many policies that have an impact, that were done today and have an impact on today. Right now in session 2, we will focus on migration today. Are we stuck in emergency? And we will try to respond in the end to the questions that we usually do on this kind of conferences here at ISPI, which are focused on the here and now and on how we can really unstuck Europe from this kind of policy response that is very fragmented and is always there, almost lingering in the background. So let me introduce the session to you. These are our guests today. We have Hanne Beirens, the Director of Migration Policy Institute Europe. Thank you so much, Hanne, for being here. Then Gerald Knaus, Founding Chairman of the European Stability Initiative. thank you, Gerald, as well. Alena Kudzko, Vice President for Policy and Programming at GLOBSEC, and Alberto-Horst Neidhardt, Interim Head of European Migration and Diversity Program and Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center. So thank you so much for joining me. And I would love to start with Hanne and ask you, Hanne, you've been following policy developments in Europe on migration for years now. We've seen in 2020 the new pact on migration and asylum being put forward by the European Commission. By now, this new pact feels a bit old. It's already 2023, and it is moving slowly. It is moving, but very slowly. So what do you think will happen? Is the pact making it to be approved, at least in some form, before the European elections in 2024? And on policy, do you think this is the right way forward? And what elements do you like of the pact, and which ones would you change?
Thank you very much, Matteo, and thank you for the invitation. And also a warm welcome from our side to all the participants. A really interesting session. Happy to be here. Yes, when it comes to the pact, I hear two parts in your question. On one hand, yes, in terms of the negotiations, where will we land? And secondly, if we zoom out, is the pact the right way forward with the current context that we're navigating? So when we look at the negotiations in the Brussels bubble, there is for the moment a lukewarm optimism as to whether it will hit the finish line in time. And Beate Gminder already mentioned that there's a really tough timeline, but they're optimistic that they will attain it. We know now, never say never, as we've seen also with Ukraine response last year. Firstly, there's a series of presidencies before the end the end of the Commission. And those are countries that really want to make sure that we have a European common asylum system, that we have a European migration system that builds on what has been built in the past. So that's a really strong team of players to look at. Secondly, there's also a very ambitious Commission. We've seen that with the Green Deal, with the COVID response. We've seen this also with the letter from President von der Leyen at the beginning of this year, really putting migration on her agenda as well, and committed to bringing the pact to the finish line. And next to that, we've seen also in the last EU summit how migration suddenly rose to one of the top of the agenda of the leaders of member states at the time. And so this is very much something that's, that member states are really keen on seeing a more different kind of response in the coming months. Next to that, we also see that the political landscape is changing, and why that may at some point result in some nervosity. At the same time, we could see new alliances between different sets of member states, which will also potentially help with moving forward the pact. So this is something which will all maybe result in parts of the pact reaching the finishing line somewhere mid-2024. But when we look at the question of whether this is the right response, I think that's a really interesting question to ask. And on the one hand, of course, yes, what the pact does is say that we need to agree on a transnational approach when we deal with migration. That might seem as a very obvious thing to us migration experts, because migration is a transnational phenomenon. But we have seen in the past couple of years how different EU member states have moved away from that pact and played solo smart, and with sometimes severe consequences for the surrounding states. Secondly, we know that a legal framework is really important because it allows us to set standards and hold them accountable to different parties. This is also a really important one. The partnerships elements, as previous speakers have referred to, is another one which is really important. And last but not least, maybe the capacity element, something we learned from 2015. We need enough funding to implement what we agree in Brussels in terms of strategy and legal framework. We need capacity, and hence also the investment in Frontex and the EUAA has been a really important one. But as you said, Matteo, the world in which the pact was created has drastically changed. Think about Ukraine and the largest displacement of forced from people since World War II is a really important one. Also, as Mr. Magri at the beginning outlined the fact that 170,000 persons have arrived already this year. So this kind of sense of crisis and the nervosity among political leaders is very real as we speak. And hence the question is whether it will rise to the challenge. And so I do think that at this very moment in time, there are some bigger questions that need to be addressed and that I sometimes miss in the conversations with policymakers. Firstly, really understanding what are the upcoming migration trends now and in the coming months and years. And I think the previous session with Mr. Mastrojeni was very interesting in that respect. And then there are bigger questions and strategic questions that need to be addressed. Firstly, what is the role that Europe wants to play when it comes to the international protection regime? We see very different answers to that if we look at the political leaders across the EU. Secondly, what is the role that migration can play when we're seeking to address very acute labor shortages and structural ones? Several of your past speakers also referred to that, and I think that's such an important one in the years to come. And three, last but not least, we have the changing geopolitics. Ukraine has really pointed that out. The world is changing, and the role and the power that Europe has to shape partnerships with transit and countries of origin may also change. So the question is, what role can Europe play in that respect as well? And so in that sense, I would end by saying, if we look at those broader questions, what is the role that a pact can play in getting us closer to the answers to those questions? I think that's a really key question we should ask. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Hanne, for also giving us this kind of bigger framework in which we can place the pact. Also, I get back to you on Ukraine specifically and maybe more. Let me now turn to Gerald Knaus, the founding member of the European Stability Initiative. And Gerald, we've been meeting over the years, and you have often advocated for this kind of quid pro quo approach in the strategy towards third countries, in particular when it comes to increasing the rate of returns of irregular migrants in exchange for opening up some legal opportunities to migrate. And so do you think this practice can achieve results? Do you think that it has in the past? What's your take on that?
Well, thanks a lot. Matteo, I hope you hear me well. I'm here up in the Austrian mountains. I was just for meetings. Great. I was just for meetings in Switzerland. Before that, meeting the Dutch Minister of Migration in The Hague and in the United Kingdom to discuss migration partnerships. But as you know, I'm based in Berlin. And of course, the coalition agreement of the current German government is crystal clear. It has a strong commitment to migration agreements. That is its strategy, its privileged strategy to try to reach out to third countries. And it wants to do so in a coalition of European countries, those who are interested, based on the very realistic sense that the European Union is deeply divided. It is as divided now as it has ever been, with a number of countries very openly saying that their model for migration management is the Polish or Israeli model: put soldiers at the border and push everyone back. And as we've seen, not a single European country has criticized Poland for legalizing pushbacks on the border with Belarus. Not one government has said that this is wrong. The Commission has not started an infringement procedure. And what I've seen around Europe is that in a lot of capitals, and I've talked to a number of interior ministers, they are saying that, look at the results of Greece compared to Italy, the pushbacks in the Aegean, which are obviously going on, which Frontex has, of course, observed, which Olaf, the EU agency, has described, and which NGOs and media have documented. The pushbacks in the Aegean have actually reduced the numbers of people arriving in Greece. Of course, you know that in the meantime, more people are arriving in Italy. So the debate in Europe between those who say the solution is pushback, soldiers, fences, giving up on the Refugee Convention, and those who say, no, we need humane control, and here the leading camp is Germany, but they also need to have an answer, because the coalition agreement also says we want to reduce, the Berlin government wants to reduce irregular migration. Their answer to it is agreements. Now, how do you do agreements? Let me just give you and close with this. One concrete example, which is shocking. and this is an unusual issue we don't discuss much, which is that last year more people paid smugglers to get into boats to leave the European Union than to get to Spain or to Greece. And that is, of course, France to the United Kingdom. And the utter, complete absence of any strategy or discussion at the European level, how democracies, on both sides of the channel, we have democracies, right? Both countries, the UK, France, and everyone in the EU, has signed and ratified the Refugee Convention, the Human Rights Convention. Everybody says we want to destroy the smuggling model. That these countries are unable, except in, this really is like the relationship between the EU and some of its neighbors. The UK says we will give you 500 million euros, you send more police. That's all they could agree on. And of course, we know this will fail. So what I propose, and that's why I was in the UK, and I'm talking to different governments in Europe, is that the European Union should offer to the UK to say, we will take back every person who leaves by boat to the UK from the 1st of, let's say, May, to stop the business model. France is safe. Everyone can be returned to France. But in return, the United Kingdom should take every year 40,000 refugees in an orderly way from anywhere in the European Union that are interested. So you open up a legal path. That means more protection in the UK. That means an end to the deaths and irregular crossings of the channel. It means France doesn't need to send hundreds of police more to the border. And it is a model how cooperation between countries that are safe can stop irregular migration. And as long as Europe is unable to negotiate something like this with its closest neighbor that is also a democracy, I don't believe any of this talk about migration partnerships is going to be real.
Thank you, Gerald. This is a very interesting take, given that it exposes the paradox of how hard it is to negotiate partnerships, even within Europe, even from a democracy to another, even though Brexit has separated us. It really exposes a few of the paradoxes that we're facing now with migration partnerships. So I think it will focus minds, and possibly your proposal will make at least a few inroads. Let's follow it. So thanks a lot. Let me move now to Alena Kudzko, Vice President for Policy and Programming at GLOBSEC. And Alena, thank you for joining us. I want to ask you, I know it's obvious you coming from an Eastern European country, but the responses to migration pressures from Eastern European countries have followed very different playbooks. If we look at the normal response from irregular migrants, we remember 2015, the relocation process, and the fact that many Eastern European countries opposed to that and even went to legally challenge that system. So these countries are not traditionally in favor of solidarity mechanism. Do you think this will continue to be the case? And are there any potential way outs or compromises that can be struck between European countries to unblock the situation?
Thank you so much, Matteo. Thank you so much to ISPI and other partners for organizing this event. I assume that we're going to talk about Ukraine a bit later, but I just wanted to say that actually, I don't think that the behavior of Central European countries is paradoxical at all. What they're doing now for Ukraine fits very well into their worldview. And one more disclaimer is that whatever I say about Central European countries is not necessarily my own private opinion. I'm just describing the position here. So if you're talking about the solidarity mechanisms, Central European countries would say we're all in favor of common solutions, of solidarity, but it's just the ideas of what we think should be done are so different from the others that we cannot find a compromise right now. What has not changed in Central Europe, and I do not think there are any signs that it will change in the future, is understanding in the region of who Europe should help and why. Central European countries think that Europe's generosity is being abused. They think that many people who are trying to enter do not qualify for international protection status. And as sad as it sounds, they would say that Europe is not in the position to help everyone who wants better life. To put it brutally, for Central European countries, some people are more deserving of help and support than others. And that's why a Central European solution to the way how migration should be managed and handled is a combination of stricter border controls, deterrence, and more possibilities to apply for asylum from outside of the European Unions. And in this particular area, Central European countries are ready to demonstrate what they would call solidarity. For example, in terms of the stricter border controls, they would be ready to send the police guards or finance Frontex if Frontex and the police guards can guard the shared European Union border, and in this way to stop the inflow of migrants. Or they would be ready, for example, to negotiate with third countries to make sure that migrants don't come here. In a way, what happened in Belarus and then over the past year with the inflow of migrants, again through the Balkan routes, vindicates the proof of concept that Central European countries are putting forward. In the case of Belarus, they say this is a typical case when migration is being abused. A lot of people who are coming there are not necessarily seeking international protection or do not qualify for it. And we have to demonstrate deterrence to make sure that other countries are not thinking about doing it again. Or if we look at the migration flows that came again from the Balkan countries over the past few months, a lot of countries in Central Europe introduced border checks. For example, there were border checks between Slovakia and the Czech Republic. Germany said that they will introduce the border controls with the Czechs if the Czechs don't do the same. So all that cascaded down all the way to Serbia. And in the end, there was a shared pressure on Serbia to make sure that Serbia suspends the visa-free travel for other nationalities who later would try to enter the European Union. So in this perspective, Central European countries say, yes, we're ready to participate there. But in other ways, we just think that the solutions are impractical and are not going to result in the favorable outcome for Europe. And finally, the final argument that they would use is that, okay, if we're talking about burden sharing, we're welcoming hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians right now. So this is our contribution to the shared migration system in Europe.
Thank you so much, Alena, for this very comprehensive response on how Eastern European countries are focusing on shaping their response and also possibly sticking to the positions. I will for sure revert to you and ask you more specifically the Ukraine questions. You already at least hinted at part of the response, but I want to get deeper into that. But let me move now to our last speaker of this session, Alberto-Horst Neidhardt, Interim Head of European Migration and Diversity Program and Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center. Alberto, thank you for joining us. And I want to ask you a very specific question on migration responses today, because we've heard about where the Migration Pact is, but at the same time, at the European Council level, so governments, heads of state and government are discussing ways to increasingly externalize migration management. What do we mean by this? They want to further border controls and foster compliance with EU rules, especially in increasing returns of irregular migrants. So in this context, we've heard renewed talk about negative conditionality, so to punish non-cooperative countries. What kind of measures has the EU considered or adopted? And then on the second turn of the table, I will ask you, what's your take on that?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone from sunny Brussels. Let me first thank ISPI for the partnership. And of course, it's also a pleasure to be involved in this international conference alongside EUI and GLOBSEC. To answer your question, indeed, there is a renewed attention on conditionality, on leverages that can be used to persuade non-EU countries to achieve EU migration management objectives. And the latest illustration of this is to be found in the conclusions of the European Council of last February, which called for the use of all relevant EU policies and tools, including development, trade and visas, as well as legal migration as a leverage to increase returns. Now, in answering to this question, I think we should put this renewed attention in context, in historical context, so looking at the kind of measures which have been adopted until today, but also we should consider the profound geopolitical changes that the world is going through and how these might affect the relationship with third countries. And this is something that other speakers have already commented on. Now, to begin with, I want to highlight that negative conditionality is actually not a new idea in EU migration policy. It was actually in the early 2000s that the first calls were made to sanction third countries that were unwilling to cooperate on EU migration management objectives. So we are really talking about old wine in new bottles. That said, in recent years, we have seen conditionality, negative conditionality clauses becoming an integral part of European migration policy. And one area where this has been used, for example, is in relation to visa policy. And I'm sure that all participants are already aware that in 2019, there was a revision of the visa code, which introduced a mechanism to take measures against third countries who do not cooperate on readmission. Other leverages are being considered, however, and these also provide an illustration of how far member states may be pushing the discussion on what kind of leverages can be used. And in recent weeks, there were lots of discussions around an explicit conditionality clause linking readmission with trade through the generalized scheme of preferences. And for those who don't know it, the GSP is a trade scheme which allows developing countries to export goods to the EU at low or minimal tariffs and aims to help third countries essentially develop their economies while encouraging them also to achieve greater human rights or labor standards, for example. Now, in its legislative proposal for renewing the GSP, the European Commission included a negative conditionality clause, essentially making access to the lower tariffs conditional on third countries' cooperation on readmission. And what this in practice means is that third countries like Bangladesh or Congo could lose access to the scheme if they refuse to take back asylum seekers whose application has been rejected. Now, there are reasons to be critical about these kinds of proposals. In the specific case of the GSP, it's very likely that withdrawing trade preferences is incompatible with WTO. But more broadly, what is important in my view is that most of the measures that have been discussed in relation to conditionality fly in the face of developing financial and trade needs of developing countries. Now, there are two crucial follow-up questions that we need to address in this context, and I'll try to respond to the first, which is why do member states put so much emphasis then on reducing irregular arrivals and increasing returns? And are these objectives justified? The second is whether these measures actually work, but I'll have time to elaborate on that later. On the first question, there are manifold reasons why the EU has placed so much emphasis on reducing irregular arrivals and increasing returns. And they are connected also with what Gerald and Hanne were saying before. And these point us in the direction of what is at stake here. And what is at stake actually goes beyond migration and asylum itself. So first, the pressure to externalize migration control responsibilities comes as a negative reaction to the lack of a strong consensus on the reforms to the common European asylum system. If the EU is not able to put its house in order, which is a metaphor which is often used, the one of the house, then we should expect even stronger actions and initiatives to externalize control responsibilities to third countries in the future. That said, in my view, we should also not automatically dismiss states' efforts to improve return governance or ensure greater oversight of who enters their territories. And I want to spend one more minute on this because it does connect with also something that Gerald was saying before, but Alena also hinted at. We should not forget that external border controls are the flanking measure for ensuring the preservation of the Schengen area. In other words, safeguarding the freedom of movement within the Schengen area depends on the capacity to effectively monitor and control persons crossing the external borders. At the same time, an effective return system is essential to ensure that there is public trust in the asylum system. And we have seen evidence of a decline in trust, in public trust in European asylum systems. So I don't think we should brush aside these objectives as such, but what we need to assess is whether the measures which have been put in place or those which have been proposed can work or do work or not, and what their costs are, also in terms of human rights obligations. But I'll have time perhaps to elaborate on these a little bit more later on.
Absolutely, you will. Alberto, thank you so much for setting the scene for this, because actually I see this kind of debate brewing in the background. So maybe now reverting to Hanne, I want to ask you, Hanne, first of all, you already mentioned the Ukraine crisis, and we've seen actually governments, we have the new pact on one hand since 2020, these proposals, and then, European governments, striving to keep the Ukraine response pretty much separated to the other, legislative framework and silos. So my question to you is: do you think that the response that countries in Europe had with Ukraine was just a one-off, or there is something to learn there? And do you expect countries to learn something from that? And maybe, if you want, you can also comment on this, on the negative conditionality part, and on this debate on measures, because I'm really interested on your take on that as well.
Thank you, Matteo. Really interesting question also, because that's of course the title of your conference and the aim of it, really looking at the future, and is this system that we have in place future-proof? Yeah, of course, the question whether the Ukraine response offers a blueprint for future response from Europe to large-scale displacement, I think there we will probably have to answer the question with a no. And already in the last session, there was a question also raised and put to Andrew Geddes about that. Of course, there's been a long frustration about this kind of idea of two standards. But I think that also relates to the fact that whereas 2015, 2016 was considered and perceived as a refugee crisis, the current crisis is more seen as a geopolitical crisis. It's Europe positioning itself towards one of its largest neighbors, which is seen as having breached territorial integrity of a state, and a concern amongst the members of the European Union that similar kind of acts could be taken by Russia in the future. And so it's very much a geopolitical crisis, and very much seen as a response and solidarity with the population there. So I think what we could see, and that links to some of the conversations we just had earlier, is whether this could be a blueprint for a response to large-scale displacement within the region of Europe or on the European continent. I think that's an interesting question to ask. Secondly, what it does, of course, do is expand and test the toolbox that policymakers and other actors working in this field have at their disposal. Think of the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive, which we hadn't seen before. So temporary protection status, we know in Europe, but also in other parts of the globe, will be an important tool in dealing with those who flee persecution and other forms. Secondly, this idea of a visa-free regime and how that impacts on entering a new territory, but also how this potentially impacts on free circulation within Europe, which was a taboo very recently, is another really interesting one. The frontline position of local authorities and what role they have taken in the response is a really interesting one as well. And we know that the European Commission is also considering how to potentially learn from the large role of citizens who have taken Ukrainian refugees inside their houses and offered support with initial reception and settlement. So there's lots of really interesting things. And we've seen that in 2015 as well, that lots of new procedures and processes and systems were tested and are now being used in response to the future. And third, and maybe really an important one, it has it was a kind of euphoric moment in Brussels when the Temporary Protection Directive was activated, because it does show that in certain times and moments, there is potential trust and confidence between the member states to take action in this front. I would like to also put this forward in vis-a-vis what Gerald Knaus was saying, in the sense that yes, there's fragmentation, and I think all of us working in this area, especially in Brussels, have seen this for years on end. But if we fast forward 20 years' time and we look back at this moment in time, what will be remembered? All of the ping pong games and all of the kind of conflicts and disputes between member states, or the fact that the EU at a very crucial time enabled now nearly 5 million refugees to get temporary protection within our continent and agreeing on that in a kind of light speed manner. Yes, there are big questions as to how member states will respond to future displacement. And all of us have referred to that. And I think it's a really crucial one. But we also have to acknowledge that there are moments where the EU has acted, where it has been united, and when it has taken and changed its migration and asylum systems. So we also need to make sure that we also acknowledge that if we are going to have to move forward and find a common solution to some of the big issues that are coming our way.
So thank you so much, Hanne. And now let me just move to Gerald so that he also has an opportunity to respond to this. It's very interesting, the debate on how much we can ask other countries to do on migration. And so my first thing that I want to ask to Gerald is, this system of, it doesn't maybe work even for Europe, but let's talk about third countries. And this kind of quid pro quo of we work with you on more legal channels and you take back migrants that are irregular here. Do you think that when we do this and we approach diplomatically third countries to do this, we're too much focusing on migration management with countries that really are needed for other things in Europe, maybe strategically, or for which Europe also, works in different ways, on trade and on development and so on. So are we subordinating too much of other EU policy priorities on migration? Second part of the question, maybe responding to Hanne, there have been moments of unity. They've been actually rare, and they may have been far in between. So what do you make of what Hanne was saying? Let's acknowledge the unitarian response, and then what? So you have the word.
Yes, well, very, very quickly, let me start with the second point, because I think on this, it's actually very obvious what has happened. We are in a situation where ministers of interior agreed, and not a single country opposed it, on the temporary protection directive for Ukrainians, because everyone knew that they had no choice. There was no alternative. If Ukrainians would have come in and they had visa-free travel, and nobody, of course, was thinking for a second not to let Ukrainian women and children flee to Europe, and they could flee legally, right? So they traveled legally. There were no smugglers. There was no crossing of green borders. Everyone knew after the first week in which 1 million people crossed that the European asylum system would be collapsed within a week unless you make sure that all the Ukrainians get temporary protection. So this wasn't a choice. The interior minister of Hungary or Austria, who might have been tempted and would definitely never agree to this for other countries, knew there was no alternative. And the moment of euphoria in Brussels came from this discovery that if reality is such that we have no other choice, well, it's great. Everybody acknowledges that there's only one thing to do. Imagine if they would not have done this. I mean, then Ukrainians would have also arrived in the same numbers, stayed for 3 months, and then applied for asylum. They would have all gotten asylum, or temporary protection, or subsidiary protection, or something, depending on humanitarian protection. Each country would have found its own solution. Some countries already introduced their own solutions. And the evidence that this was not about the EU, having a great moment of finding consensus when there was an alternative, but of responding without any alternative out there. In the end, the Swiss and the Norwegians decided exactly the same thing. Right? The only country that didn't decide on such a system is the one that didn't have visa-free travel, the United Kingdom. So let's not have a mythology. This wasn't a moment of great humanitarian response. Temporary protection was without an alternative, but, and that's the key, it was also very popular because, of course, sympathies in Europe for Ukrainians were overwhelming. And the lessons for the debates that we have in Europe at the moment, and I totally agree with everything Alena said about the position in the Central European countries. The lesson they draw, look, did you hear Poland call for distribution of Ukrainian refugees in Europe? No. None of them have been trying to push for European fair distribution of Ukrainian refugees at the level of governments. And the response at the moment is actually that the Czech Republic has more Ukrainians who applied for temporary protection than Italy, Spain, and France together. It's completely unequal, the distribution. But you don't actually have this even as a topic at the European Council, right? Because the public in those countries has supporting Ukrainians. So when you have no alternative, open borders, visa-free travel, and strong public support, then you can introduce temporary protection. And that means it's not really a model for most or almost all other situations. But the question now is, and that's your first question, what do we do about the irregular migration in the Mediterranean? Or indeed, irregular migration from Belarus to Poland, or across borders with smugglers, deadly migration with lots of people dying every year for a very long time, and where debates seem to go around in circles. And on that issue, Europe is more divided than ever, which means the countries that are serious about trying to protect the Refugee Convention and reducing irregular migration, like Germany, like France, like Denmark, like the Netherlands, countries I've visited in recent weeks, they're realizing that they need to do this as a coalition. There will be no European response to this. Now, how do you do that? What do you offer third countries? How could it work concretely? I mean, take Italy. Italy last year had 100,000 people arrive by boat. This year, in the first 3 months, the number has been 3 times what it was in the first 3 months last year. If this trend continues, it might be 200 to 300,000 people arriving in Italy by boat this year. Because you have new routes. You have people leaving eastern Libya. You have people going directly from Turkey. You have a lot of people still continuing to leave from Tunisia. Since Prime Minister Meloni is in office, the numbers have increased, not decreased. And I don't see or hear anyone in Rome who has any strategy at the moment what to do. But we all know that there has been a strategy in the past which worked in 2009, 2010, and that was the Italian Navy carrying out pushbacks. You know, basically what Greece is doing. Now, this would be the end of the Refugee Convention. That would be openly saying what Poland is doing, what Hungary is doing, openly pushing people back. I very much hope that even this government in Italy will not be tempted to do this. But if the numbers keep increasing, which governments in Europe would stop Italy? So if we don't want this to be the choice, you know, brutality, giving up on the Refugee Convention, using the military in the way Australia has done, then we need an alternative. And the alternative could only be, and now I come to the positive moment and opportunity we have. Why don't we offer 2 countries we need, countries of transit or important countries of first arrival and of origin? Of course not Afghanistan or Libya or Syria, with whom we can't negotiate, but Morocco, Tunisia, Nigeria, Senegal, the Gambia. Why doesn't the coalition of countries in Europe offer them something that has already been mentioned, which some countries in Europe are openly recognizing is necessary, which is legal migration? This is the idea in the German coalition agreement. This is what an envoy has been appointed to negotiate. To go to Morocco or Tunisia and say, listen, we, Germany, not the EU, Germany, we need legal migrants. Perhaps we can create a coalition. Perhaps other countries in Europe agree. And then we have 5, 6, 7. We want to offer you a contingent of legal migration in an orderly way. If you cooperate in taking back those of, in the case of Tunisia, only your own citizens, because Tunisia is not safe for others at the moment. But if you take back your own citizens after cut-off date fast, who do not need protection. Now, I think this would be in Italy's interest to join. If Germany offers this, and Italy has an interest to join, it's one way to reduce irregular migration. Secondly, why don't we discuss with Morocco about visa liberalization for Moroccans? They had visa-free travel to Europe until the 80s, to Spain until the 90s. If Morocco takes back anyone who leaves from Morocco to the Canary Islands or to Spain from a cutoff date, and the European Union offers Morocco what almost all of South America already has, and what it offered to Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, and the Balkans, which is if you meet all the conditions, including human rights conditions, and cooperate on readmission, your citizens can travel visa-free. You know, that would be giving a massive incentive. That is not old wine in new bottles. That has never been offered. A massive incentive to Morocco to cooperate with us on stopping irregular migration to the Western Mediterranean. So I stop here. I just say that with some countries like Germany being prepared to seriously offer legal migration, with this being in the coalition agreement, and with no alternative proposal on the table, this is what we need to pursue and show how it can work concretely in the next months, because I'm sure the EU agreement on the pact, either it won't happen or it will make no difference.
Yeah, as always, Gerald, stark positions argued very cleverly, and let me just pour at least some cold water on the figures of irregular arrivals expected to come to Italy. At least us, as we look at the general picture, we don't see more than 150,000 arriving this year, even though there have been peaks. For instance, the Tunisians departing, or actually people departing from Tunisia, mostly non-Tunisians, over the past year, so not 200 to 300,000, but a bit less. Still, the maximum we've seen in Italy in 2014, 15, 16, and not lower. So it will still put quite a pretty high pressure on the Italian reception system. So just to put this into context, it doesn't mean we don't need a solution, which it can also be argued it might be better pacts or maybe stronger pacts with the countries of origin and transit. So thank you so much. Let me move to Alena, because I want to go back just a bit, at least, to the Ukraine response. And you mentioned it, Gerald already put it in the framework of how Eastern European countries have been responding to the crisis, not even asking for instance, relocation and solidarity from other countries when Ukrainians wanted to stay there. But my question for you would be possibly, first of all, you already said that, but do you want to restate maybe what you already said, which is the Ukraine crisis just a one-off event? Or do you think that Eastern European governments are changing position, or is this just a continuation of the position? And secondly, given that most of the Ukrainians are now per capita residing in Poland, Czech Republic, and so on, do you expect this welcoming stance, or at least politically motivated welcoming stance, to stay with us for longer, or do you expect this to fade a bit and maybe even some resentment to build up in these countries?
Ukrainian situation is very specific. It does not mean that similar things cannot be done for other countries. It can be in some cases, but it does not mean that the same way of support that countries in the region show to Ukraine and Ukrainians will be extended to anybody in the world. And I'll explain why. This fits into the Central European mindset and understanding what kind of obligations Europe has and towards whom. First, there is a shared understanding that Ukrainians are fleeing an atrocious war, and it's clear who is responsible for the war, and it's clear that the war is happening right there. Second, Ukrainians are our direct neighbors, which means they have literally nowhere else to go. They cannot go to Russia, they cannot go to Belarus, and there are no countries between Ukraine and Europe. So in many cases, that's the first country of arrival. That's hard to dispute that they could have stayed elsewhere on the way to Europe. But also importantly, the way how Central Europeans are treating Ukrainians reflects understanding of our own history. Because we know that we were in a similar situation only a few decades ago when we had to flee to the Western countries. And we also have a suspicion that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, Central Europeans again might find themselves in a similar situation if again there is an attack by Russia on these countries and people will have to move westward. But also, we are talking about the influx of Ukrainians right now, starting from last year. But it's important to remember that Ukrainians have been coming to these countries in the region for years already. And it's not just the arrival over the past year, it's hundreds of thousands of others who came earlier. Not all of them actually have the protection status, quite the opposite. Most of them come for employment or came on various other national schemes, but there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who are already here. And also importantly, Central European countries have been more generous than other countries in Europe towards people from Belarus, who after 2020 have been fleeing also the dictatorial regime in the country in hundreds and thousands as well. So this also should count toward the support that Central Europeans are providing. And this support fits into the specific interpretation of history and of obligations towards other countries as well. The important case about Ukrainians is that it also shows that Europe actually has much bigger absorption capacities than we imagine. But for these absorption capacities to be actually implementable, there has to be a certain set of factors in place for it to work. First, because of this understanding of history and understanding of the realities of the war, there's a huge support of the population towards Ukrainians. And actually, it wasn't the governments who responded first. It was civil society and regular people who came to the borders and helped Ukrainians. Governments were absolutely unprepared. There were no support systems or any ability to instill some structure and order in the processing of arrivals. It was all done basically by volunteers, by non-governmental organizations, and the governments came in only later, and of course provided also certain support and welfare to Ukrainian refugees. But again, that demonstrates that the migration systems were not prepared on the governmental level to face such huge arrivals of anybody at all. But of course, let's be entirely honest, it does help that Ukrainians are racially and culturally very similar to Central Europeans. And that's an important reason why they're treated differently than some of the arrivals, for example, from southern countries. And of course, also because Ukrainians were predominantly women, children, and elderly, it also removes this bias that, okay, these are the men, maybe they should have stayed home and we shouldn't be helping them. In terms of the public support, we're doing polls to measure the support of the public opinion towards Ukrainian refugees, and the latest one we did was in December. In a majority of countries, absolute majorities of populations are seeing the Ukrainian refugees positively. Only one country was standing out, and that's Slovakia, where only about 40% of people said that their country should be hosting Ukrainian refugees. Also, in majority of countries, people say that, actually in all countries, people say that arrival of Ukrainians either has positive effect on their lives or has no effect on their lives. So this perception that Ukrainian refugees bring something negative to societies at this moment in time still at a rather minimum level. The nuances come in when we talk about what kind of support should be provided to refugees. Majority of population everywhere would say that yes, refugees should get some help in terms of the, let's say, language support or maybe some labor schemes provisions that would entitle them to enter the labor market. But more and more people are disgruntled about the welfare that's provided to Ukrainians, including the housing or the free transportation and so on, which is not provided to the local population. So in that way, there will be more and more pressure on the governments to discontinue certain types of supports that provided for Ukrainians, and Ukrainians will be increasingly expected to fend for themselves, which means they would have to get jobs and be able to get their own provisions for life as well. But in general, largely the situation would depend also on the economy in the region. For now, it's more or less the inflation is slowing down and the energy pressures will be a little bit easy in the summer. So probably for the next months, the support will still be there and we will see where we are during the next winter.
Thank you, Alena. And thank you for pointing out not just the, the political, situation that makes Ukrainians being more welcome to by Eastern European countries, but also the gender and age dimension of that being predominantly women or children, as because sometimes it escapes us. So it's always important to restate that. Let me move to Alberto because our time is fast running out, and I'm getting a lot of questions from the audience. Let me remind everyone else that you can also still send us questions. I'm not sure I can fill them to our speakers because I already have quite a few of them. But let me ask Alberto and give Alberto an opportunity to reply and tell us about these negative conditionalities that we are talking about, forcing or at least, cutting third countries out from some benefits that they enjoyed from Europe if they do not cooperate on migration goals such as increasing returns. So do they work? You were leaving us hanging from your lips. Do they work? And maybe the second question to you is, there are these policy provisions, but how many times in the past, if you have this information, have they been used? Have they been often used or seldom? Or maybe to conclude, are there any other ways to find sustainable solutions for irregular migrants in Europe. But that's a very general question. So let's start from do they work and how often have they been used?
Yeah, I will try to respond to the best of my capacity to this question. And I would have loved to come in also on the TPD and why it was activated, but I will stick to the question that you just raised. And yeah, the question whether this works or not is crucial. And this is a question that we should address in an evidence-based way. As migration remains a polarizing issue and there are different views across member states on how to deal with these questions, we should look at the data and try to understand what works and what doesn't. And we heard from IOM how important data is and how widely available is becoming. The problem is, you asked me about returns. When it comes to returns, it's really difficult to draw conclusions because there are serious issues with the data on return and readmission. The information which is available on voluntary and mandatory returns is not only incomplete, but it's also affected by serious methodological shortcomings. The only information which we have at the moment are return rates. And these are also contested, by the way, but it doesn't surprise that the essential measure of success that is taken is just increasing return rates, because these are the only statistics that we have. Now, looking at the numbers which we have, and we have to take them with a pinch of salt, return rates vary widely across member states and countries of origin, even when there are return and readmission agreements in place, and even when conditionality mechanisms have been used or considered. So in the case of visa, this has been visa suspension. This has been considered on 3 occasions, but it's only been activated once in the case of Gambia. And essentially, the results of the suspension has not dramatically changed the statistics on returns. And more in general, when there are return and readmission arrangements in place, we see an uptake in the beginning, but then a slow decrease. But still, the numbers point to very fragmented results. And this suggests that there are actually structural problems beyond return and readmission arrangements and beyond conditionality mechanisms in return governance in Europe. There are logistics and administrative failures on the part of many, many member states. There are also evidently political reasons as well as legal reasons for not going ahead with returns in many occasions. The bottom line is that lack of cooperation with countries of origin is only one among the many factors that undermine effective return rates. And so, in this context, I believe that the question should then be about the costs. What are the costs about overemphasizing return and readmission, and also over-relying on negative conditionality? And I would invite us to actually take the perspective of third countries when answering this question. As cooperation on return and readmission really goes at the heart of their economy and political systems. And using trade, visa, or even financial aid as leverage can profoundly destabilize third countries. And this is especially the case in an increasingly more fragile geopolitical and economic context. And again, we have already touched upon the consequences of the war on a broader level. But I think in this context, what needs to be clear is that it would be especially counterproductive to let return and readmission dominate bilateral relations to the point where other important objectives, such as development or international mobility, are put at stake. Now, at the same time, conditionality can only be effective as long as Europe is one or the most important partner for certain countries of origin and transit. But the reality is that despite the many efforts and the many travels that commissioners as well as European leaders have taken to countries in North Africa, for example, the EU is actually losing leverage, especially in Africa. We have seen a growing influence of China and Russia. And we have seen shifts in non-EU countries' priority. And in these contexts, the EU agenda will likely encounter more and more resistance than in the past. I'm not saying that it's not possible to actually have better partners, but evidently the use of conditionality in a restrictive way in this context will become more and more difficult, essentially because the EU's role and member states' negotiating position is at serious risk of becoming weaker. More will have to be offered to non-EU countries to cooperate. And this also applies to legal migration. And I completely agree that this could be a new ingredient that could potentially make the difference in the future. But we should keep in mind these shifting geopolitical balances. So moving forward, the EU should aim at developing credible, balanced partnerships with third countries based on mutual interests. And these could be based, of course, on an expansion of legal migration pathways. There's a strong interest on the side of the EU. There's also a strong interest on the side of partner countries when we think about their need to upskill or reskill the local population in order to achieve and address long-term challenges that they will also face. Let's just think about climate change, for example. But so in short, the agenda here cannot be dictated by short-term objectives alone, and it cannot only reflect the needs of the EU. We should really try to develop partnerships which are comprehensive and balanced. Otherwise, the results will be poor. But I'm also making a call for taking an evidence-based approach to these discussions while we have little evidence that allows us to draw any conclusion on any of these.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm especially time sensitive, but I wanted to open the floor to Q&As. Maybe just as a comment and a wider comment, let's be frank, if we really use return rates as a measure of success of these policies, we know that, returns have only been effective with, let's say, Western Balkan countries and those that really have an interest in entering the EU or to which we can really offer a lot. And then there is, fragmented success and some stories that can be told about others. But surely someone else could argue that we still haven't offered enough to these countries in order to cooperation to succeed. Let's see, because I really want to open this up to the questions from the floor, and so let me turn first of all to Gerald, then to Hanne, then back to Alberto. Let's see if I also have a question to Alena, and I will ask you, please do reply within 2 minutes each so that we are really being able to close in time. So Gerald, of course, I'll leave you some space to respond to this. But from the audience, 2 questions for you. To what extent do you think increasing returns and external border controls can be effective deterrents to persons considering traveling to the EU? So maybe the question is not just can we really increase returns, but will this really deter more irregular migrants? You already gave us some examples, but can you elaborate on that? And then also how to uphold human rights and the right to asylum. Pushbacks of mixed flows breach international law, and there are no legal pathways to access asylum, someone else says. So again, this links to the irregular migration path. If we really reduce that and discourage that, how will people be able to access asylum? Gerald, you have the floor.
All right. Well, thanks a lot. Well, let me first say I agree with the analysis of Alberto completely. And that's why I think if we want to have control through migration partnerships, 2 things must be very different from anything that has been offered until now in the past and anything that is being discussed at EU level. It has to be positive incentives, and they need to be big and sustained. So we can't buy compliance for a short period. Positive incentives are, for example, if a country has visa-free travel. And the reason the Balkans cooperate and Serbia adopts its visa rules for third countries when the EU asks it is because these countries do not want to lose visa-free travel. So that's why I think Europe needs an honest debate. Are we prepared if we want key countries, let's say Morocco or Turkey? And of course, the only reason we got the EU-Turkey statement in 2016 was because there was a very realistic option of visa-free travel, which was supposed to happen if Turkey fulfills conditions by 2016. So that is something big that is not on the table in the current EU thinking, but that would be a game changer. If you offer visa-free travel, countries are prepared to take people back. Second point, and that's a lesson I'm flabbergasted it has not been learned by more governments, but is cut-off dates. If you are asking a country to take back the 30, 40, 50,000 who've arrived and who are not anywhere in Europe and who need to leave, no country is going to agree. But if we are going to a country and say, take back the people from this date, which is, of course, what was working with Turkey. Turkey would never have accepted to take people who've left Turkey before. But the idea of a cut-off date is that then, when you just sustain this for a few weeks and you return people quicker, and then, of course, Alberto is right, there needs to be preparation on the EU side to do that lawfully, because we're not talking about pushbacks. We're talking about admissibility procedures, but these are clearly doable. I wrote a whole book about this in German, and I'm touring Germany and German-speaking countries at this moment to explain the lessons we've learned, but cut-off dates are key. So if we offer to Nigeria the prospect of legal migration for Nigerians, of tripling the number of scholarships, of facilitating visas, making them cheaper, and then we ask them to take back the Nigerians who cross from that date, then suddenly we have a very different conversation. And I'm not making this up. I mean, I traveled to these countries. I talked in parliaments in West Africa. I mean, when you present it like this, I was just with a delegation from the Gambia in Berlin, in the Ministry of Interior, 2.5 years ago, just before Corona. And that's what they wanted. You know, they said, we are prepared to take back convicted criminals and those who come after cut-off date. But the others, please keep them. In return, offer us legal migration. And last point, that's just really 10 seconds. Pushbacks are the alternative to migration agreements. Migration agreements are necessary and desirable because we don't want to see what we see at Europe's borders today. When Turkey said in early 2020 that it will not take a single person back from Greece, which was the end of the EU-Turkey statement, in March 2020, Greece decided, with full backing by the whole EU, including all the European institutions, to institute systemic pushbacks. So what we've seen since then is numbers of arrivals have fallen to Greece, but we all know how it is being achieved. By people being chased on the islands, put on plastic boats, pushed back towards Turkish waters, or grabbed somewhere in Greece, taken to the Evros, and pushed across the river. Now, that kind of behavior, which is now systematic at many EU borders, if we want this to stop and convince governments, then we need an alternative way to reduce irregular migration, and that can only be another offer to Turkey, another migration agreement.
Thank you. Thank you, Gerald. So moving to Hanne, can I ask you to respond to these if you want, and also maybe elaborate on what Gerald said already in 2 minutes. 2 questions. Can you elaborate on your point about the changing political landscape? I must admit I don't remember that. But the question asks, what are the new alliances you hinted about? And second question for you, the new pact contains worrying derogations from the EU asylum acquis in crisis situations or instrumentalization situations. Can these be reconciled with international law? This is a second question for you.
Thank you very much for the questions. Really interesting debate. On the first one, yeah, I think we saw that in the run-up to the EU summit of late, that there were a number of, some public letters, some more private, or letters that were shared in the run-up to the summit by different member states. And there you could see that the alliances that we've seen in the past, where, for example, we saw the Med5 normally getting together with, of course, very obvious common interest. We had the Visegrad countries positioning themselves in a particular way, and I could continue. And we've been talking about this for a long time, but we could see very different kind of groups of member states putting their signature underneath some of the letters. So in some degree, that's sometimes disconcerting, but in other ways, it could be interesting to reflect on what are some of the common positions and how that could further, that was in relation to the pact. And yeah, the second question, I'm not entirely sure if I understand it, because the answer was already seemed to be in the question and said that it was already mentioned as being a derogation of international law. I mean, did you fully understand it, Matteo? Because I would love to respond to whoever posed the question.
I'm not sure. If you want, you can comment. I mean, of course, it really includes the answer to its own questions. But they say, will the EU then, resort to more derogations to international law in the future, or do you think that these are just, few derogations that the EU countries consider inevitable? And maybe if you want to also reply to Gerald's point, because we need to draw this to a close. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. No, I'll quickly respond and avoid another. No, I think the first one, I think several of us have referred to that over the past year, we've seen a growing gap or a schism between what the legal standards are that are seen across the globe as being very high when it comes to, for example, protection standards. But then if we look at what happens in practice, and we've had so many examples by pushbacks and the like, to see how that's really changing over time. And the question is, what is the real asylum system in Europe? I think that's a big question that we ask. And that goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, that in response to that huge chasm or big gap, I think it's really important that we reflect on what is the role of Europe in all of these different areas. But I'll stop here to make sure Alberto and Alena have time.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I need to draw this to a close. So I really apologize to Alena and Alberto that we cannot field questions to you. But I think that these, actually there were some others that were keep coming. So this actually calls for a new event on the current policies. I would say in Europe, for sure, this was a lively debate. I really want to thank you, because such diversity of opinions, but especially such well-argumented ones, are very useful, and I hope very fruitful for further policy, reflection on policies response from the EU on migration governance and on migration policies. So thank you again for joining us today. Again, apologies for not fielding your questions, but I'm sure there will be other times, and I'm sure that our cooperation will continue in the future. Thank you from the audience, to the audience to staying with us for this conference, and I hope to see you in the future at ISPI events. Bye.